Seurat, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Denis, Matisse, Picasso, all offspring of the artist Pierre Puvis de Chavannes. Is that claiming too much? No. I am not overstating in order to glorify this French artist on whom I have worked for so many years. At the end of the 19th century, Puvis de Chavannes was the most internationally famous French artist. Actually, not just French artist, but any artist. And if you want to dispute me later, I'm ready. Far better known than those I shall try to show he served in crucial ways. Born in 1824, he died in 1898. Yet he has been neglected except by the cognoscenti and seriously searching other artists, exploring earlier artists' inventions. At the end of my talk today, I'd like to suggest why he isn't better known today. Once upon a time, long, long ago, in a far-off land, France, I first encountered Puvis' work through a sepia-colored picture postcard of his painting Le Pauvre Pêcheur, the Poor Fisherman, which you have on the screen in its full color, its full blanched color. It captivated but puzzled me. Dated 1881, not incidentally the year Picasso was born, it didn't fit in with what I knew of other 19th century work. The Poor Fisherman has a simple, pared down, eminently legible, if enigmatic, composition. 3 figures in a landscape are rendered in a spare, bare, and flat composition. They are painted in opaque, matte, blanched, and neutralized colors without shading. A gaunt, angular man stands in a boat, hugging himself in, his head slightly bowed, the poor fisherman. The figure on the shore, a girl in a wonderfully ungainly profile pose, is comprised of jagged, flattened forms and painted in singularly scrubby textures. She plucks small flowers. A bit away, a baby lies, neither perspectively back, nor really on the pictorial surface, but maintaining a tensed position that the great art historian Meyer Shapiro recognized in Cézanne's work, that of trying to be at once true both to the 3 dimensions of the visually experienced reality and the 2 dimensions of the picture plane, a pictorial quandary which eventually exploded into cubism. There is no interaction among the figures and no apparent narrative except that the fisherman, head downcast, is apparently eternally waiting for a catch. But I promised to demonstrate how some of the most forward-looking artists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were Puvis' offspring or progeny, what they took from him. To make such a leap, one needs a good running start, and as athletes know, for that good start, one needs to back up. So now something of Puvis' beginnings in his formulation of the aesthetic peculiarities, later puzzled over, admired, snapped up, and further developed into some of the fundamental characteristics of what we think of as avant-garde, modernist European paintings by these artists from Seurat, Gauguin, through Matisse and Picasso. I show you on the screen now one of his first works, Le Négrillon, Little Black Boy, of 1850. Puvis painted for 50 years, from 1848 until his death in 1898, the whole second half of the 19th century. And decade by decade, handily enough, each one a chapter of my book, from the 1850s through the 1890s, he was hardworking and productive, and his imagery was to change dramatically. On the left, then, is Le Négrillon, and it may well be representative of his early likes. That is, he went and tried to study with Delacroix, whose studio closed after 2 weeks. And then he had a short time with Couture, and then he looked closely at the work of Chassériau. And this kind of painting was the result. It's at the Musée d'Orsay now, and it transmits the romantic exoticism of the young black studio model amid studio accessories, sensually executed in strong lights and darks, reds, browns, and turquoises, against a turbulent background such as that favored by Delacroix. Puvis had turned to painting after failing his exams to be an engineer, the profession his family had wanted for him. He had a time of recovery at a family chateau, a brief trip to Italy, and then he spent a year in 1848, when he was 24, in Italy after he had decided to become an artist. He seems to have looked closely at Renaissance paintings, Giotto, Piero della Francesca, and others, and especially at important murals. Just how different Puvis' 1881 Poor Fisherman was from his early paintings, and also what was deemed the new modern avant-garde painting of his time, Impressionism, we will look at shortly. But fishing in this early work to the left hardly seems to be the point of Puvis' 1856 painting of the fisherman, again based on a studio model and a standard practice at the time in a frequent academic exercise to do a figure that dominates the work and is painted carefully with chiaroscuro, lights and darks to model the figure. Since 1922, this painting has been at the Ohara Museum in Kurashiki in Japan, only one of several important Puvis paintings there. And in only one of many, many paintings in far-flung places that were interested in acquiring Puvis' work during the years of his fame. All this international renown made people want to have his work, and it's scattered throughout the world, all of which made my research that much more difficult and also much more interesting. And here is a close-up, so you can compare from 1856, the fisherman on the left, and 1881, the fisherman of his mature style. Just how different Puvis' work was from what was then the new modern avant-garde painting of his time, Impressionism, may be garnered from comparing it to another painting of exactly the same year, 1881, and that's Renoir's Le Déjeuner des Canotiers, the luncheon of the boating party at the Phillips Collection in Washington. Renoir's sunlit composition is filled with charming figures, visibly enjoying a holiday, taking pleasure in having had a good French meal with wine, slightly soused, cheerfully engaged in interchanges and flirting, the boaters in the background. Renoir's themes are readily understandable if sanitized and prettified depictions of contemporary life. The brushstrokes are visible and even vigorous. That, too, a defining mode for much of Impressionism in its heyday in the 1870s and 1880s. Typical, too, of Impressionism in would-be everyday life, and one reason for its later popularity, is that there is no necessity for further knowledge of history, mythology, the Bible, or any other outside information for its immediate appreciation, and that much more winning for that. In comparison, Puvis' painting is melancholic and somewhat enigmatic, and that much more difficult to place. It has rarely been acknowledged that Maurice Denis' much-quoted dictum as a 20-year-old on what a painting should be, and a rallying cry for the prophets of the new painting and what we understand as modernism, was made in conjunction with his description of Puvis' Poor Fisherman. Remember, he said, that a painting, before being a battle horse, a nude woman, or an anecdote of some sort, is essentially a flat surface covered with colors assembled in a certain order. That is, prompted by Puvis' painting, he prioritized flatness, colors, and composition over subject matter. By the way, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. That's really so strangely silent. On the right, I show you a small picture by Georges Seurat, painted in 1881 when he first saw The Poor Fisherman. He was then 22 years old, and we will return to him, but I want you to note that did do this small tribute to Puvis' painting, and people have tried to understand what actually is happening in the background, in the landscape, and so forth. It's as if it were set up to paint a real person. And Gauguin also noted Puvis' Poor Fisherman. I'm showing you two versions of Gauguin's Poor Fisherman, some 15 years late, that were made some 15 years later. With sharply outlined and distinct elements, Puvis' estuary in northern France is transferred to the South Seas. The fisherman and his family are now natives, and the rudimentary flat composition, keyed up with vividly heightened and brightened colors. Critics had noted Puvis' Poor Fisherman at the Salon of 1881, but often to question it. In subject matter, it was a radical departure from his commissioned public work, and Puvis was widely recognized by the 1880s as the go-to painter of expansive mural cycles for public buildings. But these were seriously different from the morose Poor Fisherman. But the special pictorial idiom that Puvis developed for his wall paintings are key to understanding how he formulated his more personal, idiosyncratic, mature work, such as that of the Poor Fisherman. And so we'll go back some 25 years now to a few of those works to see just how that developed. By the mid-1850s, his first decade of activity, Puvis decided he wanted to do murals, the most ambitious undertaking for an artist of his time. Delacroix and Chassériau, for example, had recently engaged in such work. The only wall spaces available to him at the beginning were those of this dining room of the family chateau, Le Brouchy. So that's where he worked, and then he was hooked. Then in 1861, Puvis, who had considerable income, they're of the lesser nobility, the Puvis de Chavannes family, presented two enormous wall-sized paintings, War and Peace, La Guerre and la Paix, that he'd produced on spec, as it were, at the Salon of that year in the hope that they would be purchased. They were purchased by the new museum in Amiens, actually as a twofer. I mean, he was willing to bargain and make it cheaper so that they would get it. To garner further commissions, he turned abruptly to the most recognizably acceptable, salable pictorial mode, and that was classicism. On the screen, I show you one of his first classicizing decorative works. This one, Fantasy of 1866, is now 2 in Japan, and it demonstrates his new direction. It was one of 4 murals for the elegant townhouse of the writer Madame Claude Vignon. The subject is vaguely mythological, an Ancresque nude woman, a winged horse, and a boy fashioning a wreath in a wooded setting surrounded by high cliffs. It is in a sort of classicizing, Hellenizing manner that would often be identified with his work. And vaguely Greek and antique styles had great cachet in France by the second half of the 19th century, as it had before, and when things of different permutations from Poussin through Jacques-Louis David about how important classicizing imagery was, and it was sure to be bought by people who wanted to show that they appreciated classicizing works. The major component of fantasy is, again, largely flattened composition, executed now in non-shaded whitened colors and decidedly blue tonalities, which Puvis had experimented with before, along with rosy hues, when he had made small paintings, or what he called décoration, or which were called decorations, but not with the same meaning they have in English, and I'll get to that in a minute. And these, of course, blue hues, which I'm not showing you a lot of his works where these tonalities, strange tonalities, were prevalent, were to influence Picasso later, who looked very hard and very carefully at Puvis' work. But Puvis' ambition, as I said, was to do large mural programs. And he particularly coveted commissions for art museums, which were then proliferating in newly prosperous French cities. He was eventually to be the most important artist to execute these expansive cycles. For he executed eventually programs in Amiens, Marseille. On the screen I show you his 1869 painting, Marseille, Colonie Grecque, Marseille, the Greek colony, as a Greek colony. He did cycles for Lyon and Rouen and city halls in Poitiers and Paris, and for the Paris Sorbonne, and for the Pantheon, and finally even for the brand new Boston Public Library, his only murals outside France. These were all painted on canvas to be installed, one reason being that fresco doesn't do well in the humid, sometimes humid French climate. And so, like others before him, Delacroix and Chassériau, he painted on canvas and showed the works when they were finished, the huge paintings at the salons, and then they were transported away and all over to be installed. In Marseille, Colonie Grecque, Puvis glorifies the long history of the southern port city, established as Massilia, a colony of ancient Greece, an ancient port, and a place of commerce. We see the commerce in the right foreground, where you see some women examining some cloth. You see the bay at Marseille, and on the upper left you see a building of the Marseille of ancient times with temples and other buildings, and the general, a certain chic urban quality of ancient Marseille, which Marseille wanted to call upon for their mural for the museum. In his works, besides adopting this classicizing mode, as you see, he made sure to be specific to the cities and regions and their histories in his murals. And this was very important in furthering patronage and people wanting to have his murals. The writer and sometime critic, Théophile Gautier, admired and made much of the unusual appearance of Puvis' Marseille murals, their unshaded areas of toned-down colors and their textured surfaces, and importantly, the borders. Gautier explained these unusual qualities by comparing them to tapestries. Note that, as in tapestries, pictorial interest and weight is spread equally and evenly throughout. And the raised horizon brings interest to the upper reaches of the composition and further flattens it, while the framing borders bring weight and ornamental motifs to the outer edges. To be compared to tapestry was high praise, by the way, for tapestries were prestigious and had been since the Renaissance and highly valued. Traditionally, they were more costly and precious than paintings. They were used to insulate large castles and palaces, and actually they were used for music rooms in castles and palaces to create better acoustics for whatever concerts were going on there. So they were very much treasured. Other people thought that they looked like this work, and other works by Puvis looked like frescoes. All of this to explain the odd colors. Lodging them within these rubrics, tapestry or fresco, or speaking of them as décoration, decorations, rather than normal paintings or tableaux or murals, was important, as we'll be seeing, because under the category décoration, decoration, it helped explain the oddities of Puvis' paintings and their unusual style and thwart the usual expectation as to what they should look like. In other words, if they're tapestries, it's okay that they're not shaded. It's okay if they're not, if the background wells up and it sort of flattens the whole thing, and if the figures sort of go evenly up and throughout. In 1854-55, Puvis created a series of mural surrounds for the piano nobile, that is to say, not the entry floor, but what's called the really grand floor in palaces and also in museums in France and elsewhere, what we would call the second level when you go up the grand staircase. This is from the important new museum then of the Musée des Beaux-Arts of Lyon, France's very prosperous second city where Puvis was born and spent his youth. I'm showing you two of the works here. On the left, and it's surrounded by his murals. On the left is a version, you can see La Vision Antique, the antique vision, and on the right you see the sacred wood dear to the arts and muses, Le Bois Sacré cher aux arts et muses. I show you this also in place because it's very important to understand why he made certain decisions, and you can only understand if you see within the architectural surrounds. For example, on the left, he's picking up the color of the porphyry pilaster that ends the painting on the left there. On the right, he's taking Le Bois sacred wood, and it's filled with different muses who represent architecture, art, and painting. They're the three women in the center. And then you have the muses that represent the other arts. On the far left, going around the corner, there's a muse all by herself. She's tragedy. And that happens on the other side, too. And I think he may have gotten inspired by, in Pompeii, if you know the Villa of Mysteries, where, too, the murals go around corners and have a sort of a sensibility between them of the art coming out and going around, the imagery speaking to each other around the corners. This is, of course, the subject matter of the muses and the arts are eminently suitable for a museum because, of course, the very word museum comes from muséon, the place where the muses dwell, and here they are dwelling. So both understanding some unusual colors come from the surrounds, and some unusual rhythms we'll see come from trying to repeat the certain pacing and the certain rhythms of the Beaux-Arts architecture, which he most often was working with, so that you have, again, these figures that are far from one another, often not doing any narrative interchange. Notice, by the way, the muses coming in from the left, soaring in with a kithara, with a lyre-like thing, because that's important to remember in a minute now. So he painted the muses in an Arcadian setting for which he became famous, the mythic locus amoenus, the place of delight and pleasure. And I want to emphasize this later because Matisse will be looking at his work for just this, for showing these very Arcadian, mythic, beautiful, wonderful places where people have idyllic pastoral lives. Here is another view of the staircase, and also on the right, the main mural as you would look at it, with the edges sort of cut off. And you see again, he's using the borders that we talked about before, and the tapestry-like, perhaps, effects. Also notice here that the muses are ranged around in this wooded setting. They're cut off from the rest of the world by high mountains. The sky is golden, and it reflects itself in the lake below. Puvis used gold in a number of his murals, and I think that was probably because at the time he was part of a movement that was toward Neo-Byzantinism, imitating the gold mosaics, but gold as the backgrounds of many of his work, and people like Van Gogh would look at that pretty closely too. And now I show you both on the upper left the mural, and on the lower right is a reduced version after the mural, which it was his habit from the very beginning to paint. These reduced versions called the réduction after his murals, because once the murals were exhibited, they were sent out to wherever they were going to be installed. They were installed, and then they weren't available for viewing. And to confirm his reputation and his fame, and he was becoming very famous, he decided quite rightly that he had to have some works to show that would show what he had been doing. So he routinely, after the 1860s, did reduced versions after these works for exhibition, and that's where a lot of other painters saw the work, and that's key to understanding their understanding of Puvis' work, because they would see these reduced versions, such as you see on the right, and you see here it's opened up as if it wasn't going around corners. They would see these works without the architecture that gave Puvis the idea for using this and that color or this and that rhythm, And so the works looked all the more strange and even bizarre to them, like why would you have these colors or these figures set out in certain rhythms? And they didn't understand without the architecture the color chords or the rhythms of the figures or their carefully engineered placements that would repeat the rhythms of the pilasters and columns and the decoration, the rhythmic decorations of the architecture that the figures and other elements like trees were meant to set off and to complement. So when the paintings were seen in situ, you got one idea of it. Yes, it all made terribly good sense and was logical and fitting, and he was careful and he was seeing what the surrounds were. When they were seen separately, it was another story. They looked often strange. And particularly, I want to talk about the rhythms of his paintings. As you see, the muses are set forth in a regular sort of rhythm, a regular beat. Unlike certain kinds of Renaissance, say, paintings or Baroque paintings where there's a kind of crescendo to the center where things kind of heat up in the center and you have a climax and then you have a decrescendo or diminuendo. That wasn't true at all of Puvis' work. You have a regular beat. And I've called it a paratactic rhythm. A paratactic comes from a rhetorical term, a term of rhetoric, which means a sort of regular beat, da, 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 da. And the most known example of that is Caesar's I came, I saw, I conquered. So it's this regular veni vidi vici, and that will be typical of the large murals that Puvis was to do. So this is then the reduced version as you see it away from the mural, and you see the yellows and the golds and so forth without the gold framing device, and perhaps they seem more idiosyncratic here. The reduced version, by the way, is the Chicago Art Institute. Puvis' sacred groves and muses appealed to committees conferring commissions for murals, but seemed old hat, very, very old hat, to such viewers as Toulouse Lautrec, who must have been familiar with the small version, the reduced version, in which the ends are visible. Whether one liked Puvis' idyllic Hellenizing murals or not, by the 1880s, Puvis was an artist to be reckoned with, and so the young Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec took on the then famous artist with his own relatively large parodic painting on the right, here at the bottom, mocking Puvis and his Hellenism. And by the way, it's on view now. It's usually on loan from the Henry and Rose Perlman Foundation to the Princeton University Art Museum, but now it's on exhibition in Paris, where there's a huge Toulouse-Lautrec exhibition at the Grand Palais. So you see here that he's mocking, Toulouse-Lautrec is mocking Puvis, and he's mocking his Hellenism mostly. He's targeted the sacred wood and made it into a kind of fantasy-like theme park with anemic muses stationed here and there. And marching through, as you see, in black, is a group of sort of visitors, sightseers, including Toulouse-Lautrec himself and the small man in the foreground with his back turned, who appears to be urinating. And then there are other recognizable figures from his entourage and a famous poet and so forth coming through. So basically what he was saying was that it's a kind of satire, it's a manifesto really, on a proper imagery for modern times. Like this is foreign, the muses are just like some kind of theme park. In 1872, Puvis started creating different kinds of allegorical figures than had ever been really created before. One thinks of female allegorical figures as being voluptuous and mighty. You think of Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. You think of later Bartholdi's Liberty Enlightening the World, a Statue of Liberty. Those are big, strong, healthy women. Not so Puvis' 1872 painting of Hope, or L'Espérance. He did several versions. This one is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, And it's important that he was painting this 2 years, in 1872, 2 years after the 1870-71 Franco-Prussian War, which was where Paris was defeated terribly, and where Paris was terribly defeated. There was enormous devastation. There was enormous bloodshed. And here you have Hope, now a very wan, frail young girl, embodying in her new physical type the frail, perhaps, Hope after the desperation and disaster of the Franco-Prussian War. She's sitting in the background. You see the crosses of the graveyards, and she's holding up a little twig, a sort of olive twig representing peace here, I think. It was this kind of, and she's sitting, of course, on a drapery, sort of like a studio drapery, and this kind of subject was going to, again, have a lot of impact on younger painters, partly because if you really look at her body, her upper body is facing us, and she's in the foreground, but her hip is kind of hoisted up, and her legs are over on the side. And people said that this was a kind of Egyptianizing, perhaps, way of having a composition. Gauguin looked closely at Espérance. First, when he did his ceramics, you see in the ceramic there, his vase with Hope, or he called it Cleopatra. It became a sort of a femme fatale Cleopatra in his rendition. But he also took a photograph of it with him when he went to the South Seas. And here he paints a painting on the lower right, Still Life with Hope, which includes not only the Hope in the upper left and a little remnant picture of a Degas below it, but in the middle it has the sunflowers that especially Van Gogh painted, and Gauguin wrote quite a bit about this, saying that very much, Puvis, he's so old-fashioned, he shows an allegorical figure of hope, but Van Gogh and people like, in our circle, like Van Gogh and myself, we have a much more interesting symbolic way of showing hope. We don't have to do it with female figures, we do it with flowers and highly symbolic things. So Gauguin wrote repeatedly of Puvis, usually to put Puvis down and brag about his own great insight, inventiveness, and originality. And to my mind, he doth protest too much, saying that he's the great one and Puvis is the lesser person. But he certainly brings him up a lot. And he also brings him up, I think, when he transfers Puvis' figure to the South Seas, and instead of the white drapery on which she's sitting, she's now the Queen of the Arawa, and she's sitting on a cloth that has the flora of Tahitian flora on it. But as you see, it's reversed, but it's the same figure that he became so obsessed with to include it in ceramics and in various other paintings. As you see here. So too, again, she's turned around and even more, but it's really almost a mirror image of the figure that Puvis had devised. And Gauguin protested again, as I said, his own originality, writing to a friend, Charles Maurice, "Ce n'est pas une toile faite comme un Puvis de Chavannes." It's not a canvas made like Puvis' canvas. And also I show you Maurice Denis, who I quoted earlier about what a painting should be before it's identified as the subject matter. And he did his own version, nude with bouquet of violets, as you see here. And another tribute to Puvis, of a 20-year earlier painting. Now I'm going to show you a very important painting by Puvis on the right, It was presented at the Salon of 1879, that is 2 years before Puvis' Poor Fisherman, Jeune fille au bord de la mer, young women near the sea, by the sea, on the right. And when it was presented at the Salon, it was presented, the title was given, but it also was subtitled, or next to it, un panneau décoratif, a decorative panel, as if to say, I want you, the public, to understand that this is not just a regular easel painting or tableau, although it's a large easel painting size. I want you to understand it as a decorative panel. And on the left, I'm showing you a painting of about the same time, 5 years later, by the important Salon artist, William Bouguereau, which is now in the Chicago Art Institute, which will show you what really was expected of an artist when he did a bather. Now, bathers, as you know, are a hugely important subject in Western art. Often as a bather is shown as a reason for showing nude or semi-nude women sort of lolling around on the beach or next to the water. And of course, we can think of that. And notice you do see in the Bouguereau that you have then the much more modeled through darks and lights and so forth figures. Bathers have been very important in the history of Western art. On the left, I'm showing Titian from 1520, which is now in Scotland, and often it's one of the subjects, mythological subjects for a bather, is the birth of Venus. As you know, she was born from the waves, and so Botticelli showed her coming in on a half shell, as it were. And often she's shown, as in Titian, wringing out her hair from, having just come in from the ocean. So that's typical in the history of art, of showing such a bather. Puvis' works are rather more different. But first, let me tell you something about the name of calling it a decorative work. So he was certainly saying that his painting, Puvis, the Jeune fille au bord de la mer, which is at the Musée d'Orsay with another version that's also there, was painted to not be understood as if it were a normal painting with shading and so forth. And I've gone through with you some of the analyses and characteristics of the flattening and whitening and blanching of the color and so forth. Now look at the three figures, though. They're very separate from another, as the figures in the Poor Fisherman would be shortly. There is no interchange among them. They're actually visibly turned from one another. They're in rather curious poses, too. At left, lying down, is a figure that's sort of zigzagged along the surface. Her legs do not come towards us. They're not foreshortened, and she seems to be, thinking there. In the center is a figure who's wringing out her hair, perhaps you could say, or holding up her hair, much like the Venus that we see on the left, but her back is turned to us. And on the right, you have the third figure who has sort of clumsily has her arms. She's propping herself up with her arms. Notice her profile head, too, where it becomes very curious in terms of you see an ear and you see the head turned away. And then most of her body is cut off by the frame of the picture. So clearly you have no narrative here because you don't have any social interchange among the figures. And this is very different from the whole history of narrative history painting, where figures are acting out some drama, some story, something specific, something that you're supposed to know about, something that you're supposed to think about, something that you're supposed to analyze and understand. We're not really understanding what's happening here, perhaps, but we do know that they're there as figures and placed there. I'm going to show you a series of drawings to show you just how pointedly Puvis got to this and what he rejected when he was thinking about this work. There are far more drawings than I'm showing you, and in many of these works, they're looking at how he went from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to decide what he wanted. Certainly shows you that he didn't just fall into certain things, but he was very decisive selecting what he wanted to show. So here on the left is one of the drawings that I show you, it's a standing nude women seen from the back, and you can see that he does do shading if he wants to do it, and he does do a careful model. Also, this is in the Musée de Picardie in Amiens, where a lot of his paintings and drawings are. And notice also, of course, that it's squared. And as you know, you squared a drawing if you wanted to transfer it and enlarge it to a painting. And he may have used this, but then he certainly changed the final painting to erase and eradicate the modulations that you see in the drawing. Here I'm just showing you a second version, a reduced version after the painting that he did, which is also in the Musée d'Orsay, where he experimented with heightening the color and changing a little bit the landscape. But also notice that in both of these he has a sort of tripartite composition, which will be taken up by people like Matisse and others, and that is to say, you have the shore, you have the sea or the water, and then you have the sky. So you have these three ribbons in the background, and of course the mountain on the left prevents you from looking at a deep perspective. So other things are figured out to not shove things, that's a little rude, to make things not disappear into the background, to bring them up close. And here are several other than earlier drawings where he's figuring out, and there are many, 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 many. He worked hard. So you can see on the left where he's turning and changing and torquing the various models. And particularly he did several like the one on the right where you see, yes, he can do perspectival foreshortening. Okay, so you saw that he could do perspectival. He could do all that stuff, but he chose not to. Okay, it's very important. So on the left, I show it to you again. And I'm showing his great admirer Seurat on the right doing Les Poseuses, which is the three models, where again, now Seurat takes three models and he turns them from each other, looking at Puvis and saying, that's sort of an interesting idea. I'm going to go faster a little bit now. Or Paul Gauguin transferring the three women now again separate, and this separateness is important to the women on a beach, Tahitians on the plage at the Met, and you see then the separate women, and again the central woman with her back turned. And by the way, some of you art historians, if you can think of other back-turned central figures where there's not just among a big group, tell me. Now, I show you in 1882, he's beginning to be at the height of his powers, one of two paintings of Du Pays, Pleasant Land. The large version is in the Musée Bonnat in Bayonne in France, and the small version is at the Yale University Art Gallery. And some of the things that I've been saying now come in very strongly. But just saying he's framing the painting with the woman raising her left arm. He again presents a mountain behind her so you can't look deeply in. Again, he has golden skies. Notice that when he puts what seem to be arbitrary forms on, like the woman there who's on her stomach more or less with her elbow up, that he does a certain amount of rhyming of limbs. That is, he repeats her limbs in the kind of elbows going up of the little wrestling boys, and the boy sitting, or the girl, or whatever, the non-gendered person there on the cliff is sort of sitting like the hope, again, pulled forward in that painting. So Matisse, as I said, looked very closely at the Puvis' work, including Du Pays, the Pleasant Land, and thought about doing idyllic works when he was at the turn of the century, around 1904. And in the right, I'm showing you his works, Luxe calme et volupté, Luxury, Calm, and Voluptuousness, which comes from a poem by Baudelaire, which is important for understanding Arcadianism and the kind of vogue for Arcadian pastoral paintings in the 19th century at this time. The Baudelaire poem, it comes from a poem called Invitation au voyage, invitation to the trip, to the voyage. And it starts with la meaning there, meaning somewhere else. There everything is calm, luxurious, and voluptuousness. And an understanding of Arcadia, even from ancient times when Theocritus first dreamt it up, is that Arcadia is somewhere else. We all hope for it. It's this beautiful place. We're in chaos, cataclysm, havoc, but we dream of this wonderful, idyllic, paradisical, Edenic place there. And this had a certain vogue then at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And I hope you can see that even Matisse did several renditions of this, but I hope you can see that not only is the landscape similar, but the idea of lolling about and separately and so forth is too. Yes, Matisse did know Puvis. Yes, Puvis helped him get into an important exhibition. Yes, there is correspondence to that. So I'm not just, that they did know he did admire his work. And then you have Matisse going even further in terms of reducing the different elements of his work. So again, you have Puvis on the left, and you have Luxe number 1 and Luxe number 2 by Matisse. And I want to say that without Puvis' Jeune Fille, you wouldn't have this Matisse, and we'll argue later. So when you see tripartite, you see simplification, you see separateness, you see activity. Okay. So as was his wont, the protean and prodigious Picasso of the penetrating eye picked up a potpourri of ideas from Puvis at several junctures. Yes, I love alliteration. As he did from a host of sources. His blue period paintings certainly speak of that. Picasso, born in 1881, the time of the Poor Fisherman, came to Paris. The first time he did do actual drawings after specific Puvis paintings, murals at the Pantheon and so forth. And I'm showing you, and he did very much interested in Puvis. On the right, the Tragedy, which is in Washington. It's only one of a number, as you know, of blue, the sort of blue, called the so-called blue period works of these skinny, angular figures. Again, they're quite separate from other. The head is hanging down. You have the simplified background of the shore, sea, sky, and I think the point is pretty clear. And his blue period paintings, in their essentialism and in their figural types and in their melancholia and tonalities, I think all take from Puvis' experiments. Next year there will be an exhibition of early Picasso, and they're going to be showing Puvis. It's going to be in Toronto and at the Phillips Collection, and so it'll be interesting, and I'm helping choose the Puvis for the painting, for the exhibition. Or even I would say that this later Picasso, Les Baigneuses, the Bathers, which is in the Musée Picasso in Paris, a very small painting, also owes a lot to the Puvis. Even you could say the way that the woman is holding up her hair, but she's in a striped bathing suit. And the woman who's lying down there in the orange bathing suit is like the reverse of the Puvis painting. And so I think this too owes a lot to Puvis. Now, Van Gogh, a little bit of Van Gogh. Van Gogh, as we say in Amsterdam. In a fascinating, erudite, and touching letter to his brother, in his fascinating, erudite, and touching letters to his brother Theo and his artist friends, Van Gogh wrote what he was thinking, confronting, and working out. He wrote repeatedly of Puvis' work, describing several in detail and accompanying his comments with small exacting drawings from memory of his big murals and other passages in his work. He discussed poses, proportions, and vividly specified the colors. His yellow skies must have brought to mind the gold skies that Puvis used, as in the Pleasant Land. And there are other things that are not so apparent, such as Van Gogh's double square formats were surely based on the unusual dimensions of Puvis' decorations, which in turn were determined by architecture. Indeed, it was Van Gogh's interest in Puvis that led the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam to ask me to curate an exhibition of Puvis and his influence, which I did long, long ago in 1994. Here I'm going to compare only two portraits, Puvis' 1882 portrait of Eugène Bénon, about which Van Gogh commented extensively, and on the right, Van Gogh's portrait of Dr. Gachet, one of two versions. These aren't grander official portraits. On the contrary, they're candid characterizations in which informality is the body language of both. The sitters seem to have been taken unawares. Bénon, of a certain age, is reading, and with presbyopia, he squints a bit and holds his book away to see better. Gachet looks distracted, perhaps bored, and none too pleased at posing. The few other elements of the compositions are similar. The visual entry through the triangular table at the lower left, and in both an unprepossessing still life, a few sprigs of flowers in a tumbler of water. I'm showing you now just to show the large lecture hall at the Sorbonne, the main lecture hall, which has a huge Puvis de Chavannes painting in it. It's interesting enough of itself, and there is a study for it, not a reduced version after it, but a study at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Why I'm showing it simply in situ is to remind you that the architectures I've been insisting and repeating, as you see, has a certain rhythm, and it has certain elements and the borders for the painting. And it has this regularity which Puvis picking up. He separates the groups with trees, but it has a certain rhythm between the trees and the figures that really are meant to pick up the rhythms of the architecture, and the architecture is enhanced by the figures spread out in this very same way. And so that's a good example that I wanted to show you of some of the central things that Georges Seurat picked up from Puvis. He picked up a number of the pictorial devices. And I showed you les poseuses, but these paratactic rhythms that I've talked about really are in Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the Island of the Grand Jatte, and more insistently maybe in the Seurat's Circus Sideshow on the right, which is in the lower right there, which is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You see even the little sprigs of lights there that go in those very same rhythms, and how the figures are spread out there below, and even the lower level where you have the spectators also in this paratactic rhythm. When, not coincidentally, when the Grand Jatte was shown, some critics said it was tapestry-like, just the same way that they talked about Puvis' early work when they didn't know what to make of it. And the neo-impressionist pointillist dots of color in the Grand Jatte were described as stitches of color. Seurat's borders, which you can't really see very well here, but they're very important in his work, also owe something to Puvis, bringing weight and interest to the far reaches of the work. Remember also that the astute critic Félix Fénillon called Seurat un Puvis modernisant, a modernizing Puvis. So that was recognized at the time. After the havoc of the First World War, There was what has been called a return to order in art. No more fragmentation of cubism and other difficult revolutionary styles, but a time of healing was called for, and a time to regain a semblance of equilibrium, and a retreat to a traditional Hellenizing, idealizing work. This is notably and most famously exemplified by Picasso's classicizing period. I want to contend that he looked at classicism by way of Puvis. In this instance, Puvis' late last easel painting on the left, his 1897 La Madeleine, or the Magdalena, which is now in Hungary, which has long been in Hungary. Here, the Magdalene is calmly seated at the seaside with nothing to indicate that she is the New Testament sinner who, through contemplation, recognized the sinfulness of her ways. And I haven't gone through when different artists could have seen various works of art, but it all checks out. And in this case, Puvis' Magdalena was shown in Paris in 1897, in 1899, and in 1904, and then shown in Vienna in 1898. On the right are two of what I claim are Picasso variants, the seated woman in a chemise and woman in white of 1823. So, the Seurat, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Denis, Matisse, Picasso wouldn't have been what we know them to be, the meticulously engineered rhythmic compositions by Seurat, the idyllic classicizing joy of life fantasies of Matisse, blue period Picasso, if they hadn't been looking closely at Puvis' sometimes curious paintings. Indeed, many art historians have rather backed into Puvis when they tried to explain just how it was, for example, that Picasso came rather suddenly to do skinny, angular figures in strange tones of blue. To conclude, there are three main reasons, which I'd like to talk about, that Puvis is not better known today. First, he was a victim of his own success. His drawings and easel paintings were much sought after, sold, and collected, many through the Durand-Ruel gallery that also represented the Impressionists. They were hugely scattered, as I've indicated, and to be found worldwide. Other works remained in the private collections of his collateral descendants, who had and retained scores and scores of paintings and literally thousands and thousands of drawings. Secondly, the classicizing genre of much of Puvis' public work, the mode with which he is most often associated and perhaps best known, has proved difficult for many contemporary viewers. That is, just getting past that very device that he employed to give the work prominence proves nowadays to be a stumbling block. At the time, they offered cachet. It's not at all clear they do anymore. When glanced at superficially, figures in Greek drapery and chitons set in pastoral settings may seem terribly ho-hum, if not seriously dated and literally antiquated, especially at a time that modern Paris urban life and its surrounds were exciting to such contemporary artists as the Impressionists. Opprobrium toward the old and traditional, indeed the classical, was precisely pinioned as passé in Toulouse Lautrec's wittily scathing parody of Puvis' Sacred Wood. But looking past the draped chitons and laurel wreaths and Pegasuses, and more closely at Puvis' work, as the post-impressionists listed this evening and Matisse and Picasso did, Puvis actually proved to be an aesthetic wolf disguised in classicizing sheep's clothing. Finally, the reason Puvis has not received his due more generally is that art historians have seen fit to categorize 19th century French art into movements: classicism, romanticism, realism, impressionism, and so on. Puvis' work does not fit these Procrustean categories, though people have pushed and pulled and tried to classify him as, for example, jamming into the category of symbolism. His work can't fit into these pre-existing tendencies. So, as works are discussed by way of these groupings, he has simply fallen between the cracks and by the wayside. Thank you.